My name is Ainsley McDonald. I'm 38 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've built my career as a corporate project manager, overseeing large urban developments. It's a demanding job that requires precision, patience, and constant problem solving, skills I've honed to a fine edge. But outside the office, I'm fiercely protective of my personal space. A downtown condo I bought with years of careful saving. That place is my sanctuary, a quiet refuge in the middle of the city's chaos. It's more than just an investment. It's a symbol of my independence and hard work, a space I've curated to reflect the life I've built on my own terms. I recently returned from a week-long business trip to Rome. The trip was a whirlwind. Endless meetings, client dinners, and early mornings filled with jet lag, but I was excited to come home. I had been looking forward to slipping into my quiet routine again, to the familiar creak of the hardwood floors, the soft hum of the city outside my windows, and the comforting presence of my husband, Ethan. But the moment I stepped through the front door, something was off. The usual scent of lavender candles and fresh linen had been replaced by the sharp, acrid smell of sawdust and paint thinner. My eyes immediately caught the chaos in the hallway. The floorboards were covered in dust and scattered tools. I followed the noise to the kitchen and froze. The kitchen, my carefully designed minimalist kitchen with its sleek countertops and spotless appliances, was half demolished. Cabinets had been ripped down, and drywall was crumbled at the edges. More shocking, the bathroom was in worse shape, with the toilet and sink ripped out and exposed pipes dangling. Water was still dripping steadily, echoing through the hollow space like a ticking bomb. My heart pounded as I processed the scene. The renovations were halfway done, but there had been no warning, no permission asked. And then I saw him, my brother, Jackson, standing among the rubble, wearing a paint-streaked shirt and a grin like he'd just won a prize. "Hey, Ainsley," he said casually, as if he were greeting me on a sunny afternoon, not invading my home. "We're renovating before moving in. Me, Emily, and the kids. Thought it'd be easier to get it ready before the big move." I blinked, trying to digest his words. "You're renovating? Without telling me?" I managed to say, my voice trembling between disbelief and a need to stay composed. He shrugged, unconcerned. "Well, yeah, it's a family thing, right? We're just making it better, so the kids have a place to settle. No big deal." I looked over at my parents, who had come along with him. My mom was chuckling softly, a dismissive smile playing on her lips. "Ainsley, don't be so uptight," she said. "It's just a little work, for the family." Emily, Jackson's wife, smirked and added, "You're always so sensitive about these things. We're just helping out." I swallowed hard, my mind racing with 1,000 questions and protests. Wasn't this my property? Hadn't I paid for every inch of this condo? Yet no one seemed to care. The laughter and lighthearted jabs felt like a knife twisting in my chest. My authority, my rights, my space, it all seemed invisible to them. But I said nothing more than, "Okay." The word felt heavy and hollow leaving my mouth. It was the easiest thing to say at that moment, a quiet surrender masked as calm acceptance. Inside, I was boiling. How could they just decide this without me? How could I remain the reasonable one when they all seemed to dismiss my ownership as a mere formality? That night, I sat alone amidst the noise of the ongoing renovations, the sound of drills and hammers echoing like an assault on my sanctuary. I replayed the scene over and over. Jackson's casual grin, my parents' laughter, Emily's smirk. The condo wasn't just a home. It was my hard-earned fortress, and it was being dismantled piece by piece while I stood silently by. I knew then that this was more than just renovations. It was a boundary crossed, a line drawn in the sand without my consent. What I didn't yet realize was how deeply this moment would unravel the family ties I'd always believed in, and how it would force me to reclaim my space, my respect, and ultimately, myself. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how things came to this moment where my own blood seemed so ready to trample over my boundaries. The truth is, this dynamic didn't just appear overnight. It's been decades in the making, woven into the fabric of my childhood and every family gathering since. Jackson, as the eldest, was always the golden child. From the earliest memories I have, he was shielded from consequences. When we were kids, If trouble stirred at school or home, somehow Jackson always seemed to get a pass. Our parents, Margaret and Robert, would shower him with gentle words, excuses, or sometimes just look the other way. Meanwhile, I was the one who got the lectures, the blame, the "why can't you be more like your brother?" comparisons that echoed through my head like a broken record. I remember one particular incident clearly. We were around 10 or 11, and Jackson had broken a neighbor's window while playing baseball. When the neighbor came to complain, my parents exchanged glances, then simply told Jackson to apologize and promise to fix it quietly. No punishment, no consequence beyond that. But later that week, when I lost a school project I had worked so hard on, I was scolded for being careless and not taking responsibility. It was a pattern that repeated itself endlessly. Jackson's mistakes brushed off, mine held up as examples. This favoritism wasn't just about discipline. It shaped how love and attention were distributed. Jackson's achievements, no matter how small or grand, were celebrated with enthusiasm. I remember when he got his driver's license. Our parents threw a party, invited the whole family, and framed his license in the living room. When I got my first promotion at work in my early 20s, the congratulations were polite but lukewarm. I learned to expect less fanfare and to keep my successes quiet. The condo itself, my sanctuary now, was bought with money I saved from years of overtime and sacrifices. I had hoped it would finally be a place where I was in control, where my efforts were honored in a tangible way. But even that became a source of silent tension. While Jackson and his family treated it as a future family home, ours, as he phrased it, the fact that it was really my investment seemed to slip their minds entirely. Over the years, this endless favoritism morphed into a subtle but constant expectation. My generosity was limitless, my boundaries negotiable. Family vacations were another sore point. I was often excluded or invited last minute, the rationale being that Jackson's needs came first because he was the head of the family. During moments when I needed support, like when I was ill or going through difficult work challenges, I was met with indifference or told to tough it out. But when Jackson faced any problem, the whole family rallied around him, dropping plans or stepping in without hesitation. I used to tell myself it was just how families are, imperfect, messy, full of quirks. I rationalized their behavior as love expressed in flawed ways. But the truth, buried beneath the surface, was that favoritism created a hierarchy where my worth was always less than Jackson's. It wasn't just about love, it was about power and entitlement. This pattern of being overshadowed and dismissed made me cautious. Over time, I stopped voicing my frustrations because it always seemed to fall on deaf ears. I became the quiet mediator, the one trying to keep peace even as my own needs were sidelined. I paid bills, helped with family crises, and offered shoulders to lean on, but it was never enough to equalize the scales. Looking back now, I see how this favoritism paved the way for what I'm facing today. Jackson's assumption that he could tear apart my home without permission, that my protests would be laughed off by the very people who should have my back. It's a culmination of decades of being invisible in my own family. The condo isn't just real estate. It's a symbol of how little my ownership and autonomy have been respected. This isn't just about property. It's about a lifetime of being the second priority, the overlooked daughter, the quiet giver. And while I once tried to accept this as normal, I'm starting to understand it for what it really is: a betrayal of trust, a disregard for boundaries, and a challenge I'm no longer willing to ignore. Over the years, I found myself in the role of the family's silent backbone, the one who picked up the pieces and held everything together, often at a personal cost I barely acknowledged at the time. Financially, emotionally, professionally, I poured into the family in a way that went largely unnoticed or, worse, taken for granted. I remember the early days after finishing college and landing my first real job. Jackson was still figuring out his path, fumbling through odd gigs and struggling to get his own business off the ground. When he finally came up with the idea for that small construction company, it was my savings that gave him the initial push. I wired him money more than once, sometimes at the expense of my own bills. I didn't keep receipts or tally how much. It just felt like the right thing to do. Family first. I told myself. Except, of course, the family that benefited most was Jackson's. Emily, his wife, was always quick to accept help too, but rarely to acknowledge or reciprocate it. There were times when I had to say no to career opportunities, job offers in other cities with better pay and growth potential, because someone in the family needed me. My mother's health issues were a constant worry, and Jackson's demands for help became more frequent as his business grew. I deferred promotions and turned down relocations so I could be available to mediate disputes, manage logistics for family events, or drive my parents to appointments. It was exhausting, but I convinced myself it was temporary. I believed that if I just kept giving, they'd see and appreciate my sacrifices. But appreciation never came. Instead, the expectation only grew louder. When I stopped funding Jackson's latest business expense or hesitated to help with a repair bill, I was met with surprise or subtle guilt trips. "You're always so generous," Emily would say with a smirk, as if generosity was an endless resource. I'd been foolish to think otherwise. My parents would nod along, their eyes avoiding mine, as if my role as the provider was just the natural order of things. Emotionally, it was even more draining. I was the one people called when things went wrong. Jackson's business hit a snag, the car broke down, or a family crisis erupted. I was expected to listen patiently, offer solutions, and keep the peace. But when I needed support, the line was silent. During stressful periods at work or moments of personal struggle, my concerns were brushed aside. "You're strong, Ainsley," my mother would say, a phrase that felt more like a dismissal than encouragement. Ethan, my husband, saw this imbalance clearly and urged patience, reminding me that families have their own rhythms and that harmony was worth preserving. But even his reassurance couldn't mask the growing ache of invisibility. Coordination fell on me like a second job. I arranged birthday parties, holidays, and family dinners, often spending weekends cleaning, cooking, and managing logistics while everyone else relaxed. I kept track of schedules, payments, and the endless small details that kept the family machine running. Yet, in family gatherings, Jackson and Emily often took center stage, effortlessly commanding attention and praise, while I hovered in the background, the unacknowledged keystone holding the arch together. The condo itself was one of my proudest achievements. Bought with painstaking savings and more than a few personal sacrifices, it was my declaration of independence. Yet, as years passed, it became clear that the family viewed it less as my property and more as a shared asset, a place for Jackson and his family to eventually settle. I found myself fielding casual remarks about our future home and when the kids move in, as if ownership was a family birthright rather than a legal reality. I held my tongue, hoping respect would come with time, but the assumptions only deepened. Looking back, I realize how much I internalized the role assigned to me: the giver, the fixer, the quiet supporter. I suppressed my needs and silenced my frustrations, believing that being the steady presence was more important than claiming space or recognition. It was a heavy toll, one that slowly eroded my self-worth and blurred the lines between generosity and exploitation. Every dollar lent, every hour spent smoothing tensions, and every opportunity deferred chipped away at my sense of self. Yet, the hardest part was not the sacrifices themselves. It was the invisibility that came with them. While I was juggling budgets, work stress, and family drama, Jackson and his family moved forward on their terms, often oblivious to the cost I bore. Emily's dismissive smiles and my parents' selective blindness became wounds I carried quietly. Now, standing amid the chaos of a half-demolished kitchen and bathroom, I see with painful clarity that my long-standing hope for recognition was misplaced. My past generosity was never a bridge to mutual respect. It was a trap that allowed them to take what they wanted without consequence or gratitude. But I refused to be trapped any longer. The years of sacrifice, the endless giving, and the quiet endurance have brought me to a crossroads. For the first time, I'm beginning to see that my worth is not measured by how much I give away, but by how fiercely I protect what's mine: my home, my boundaries, and ultimately, my dignity. This realization marks a shift. No more silent compliance. No more being the family's invisible bank or emotional buffer. It's time to reclaim the respect I deserve, even if it means shaking the foundations of the family I thought I knew. And that's where I stand now, ready to face what comes next, armed with the hard-earned wisdom of years spent giving too much and getting far too little in return. That family gathering was supposed to be a simple weekend brunch at my parents' house, a chance to catch up, laugh, and pretend everything was fine. Instead, it became the stage for one of the most humiliating moments I've ever endured, a moment that laid bare the deep fractures beneath the polished surface of our family. Jackson, always the showman, was in rare form that day. With his usual swagger, he stood near the kitchen island, glass of wine in hand, casually steering the conversation toward what he clearly saw as his trophy prize, the condo. "You know," he boomed, drawing the attention of nearly everyone in the room. "This McDonald family condo is going to be our future home. Emily, the kids, and we're making plans. It's going to be perfect for us." The room hummed with nods and murmurs of agreement. My parents exchanged looks that, to me, said volumes: approval, pride, and a shared disregard for my feelings. But what struck me hardest was the way Jackson said it, as if the place belonged to all of us equally, as if I were just some silent bystander in my own home. I felt my mouth go dry. The words hung in the air like a slap. Ownership, a concept so clear and concrete to me, was reduced to a vague, communal notion when it involved Jackson. I opened my mouth to correct him, to say, "Actually, that's my condo." But the words caught in my throat. Before I could even make a sound, my mother's voice cut through with a soft laugh. "Ainsley, you're always so sensitive," she said, waving a hand dismissively as if I were a child overreacting to a harmless joke. Her tone was light, but the message was clear. My feelings were not just unwelcome, they were an inconvenience. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. The room's laughter grew a little louder, but it was Emily who delivered the sharpest sting. Standing beside Jackson, she tilted her head, a smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, come on, Ainsley," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You're so stubborn about this condo thing. It's not a big deal. We're family. Don't you want us to be happy here?" Her words were coated in condescension, as if my boundaries were childish obstacles to their family happiness. I felt every eye in the room glance toward me, waiting to see if I'd join the joke or fight back. The cousins exchanged amused looks, some whispering behind raised hands. It was a public spectacle designed to isolate me, to make me the outsider in my own family. The sting of their dismissal cut deeper than I expected. I tried to steady my voice. "It is a big deal," I said quietly, but firmly. "This is my property. I bought it. I maintain it. That means something." Jackson rolled his eyes, clearly bored with my objection. "Ainsley, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. We're just planning for the future. You're being dramatic." His words were laced with that familiar tone of entitlement, the assumption that because he was the eldest, his desires outweighed my rights. I bit back a retort, knowing that in this room, my protests were already lost. The conversation pivoted away, as if my statement had never happened. The laughter resumed, lighter this time, but the damage was done. I was left feeling invisible, dismissed, and deeply wounded. This wasn't just about a condo. It was about years of having my ownership, my sacrifices, and my voice erased in favor of Jackson's grandstanding. I remember standing near the window, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the backyard. The hum of distant lawnmowers and children playing outside contrasted sharply with the cold, constricting silence I felt inside. I wanted to scream, to demand respect, but the words felt useless against the tide of favoritism and dismissal that had swallowed me whole. That day, something inside me cracked. The polite smiles, the forced laughter, and the casual disregard weren't harmless family quirks. They were wounds, slowly inflicted over a lifetime. And as I looked around at the smiling faces that refused to see me, I realized that the condo was more than a building. It was a battleground for respect, recognition, and finally, my voice. The humiliation stung fiercely, but beneath it, a quiet fire began to kindle. I didn't know yet what I would do with that fire. but I knew I couldn't keep pretending that my boundaries didn't exist. That brunch marked a turning point, a moment when the invisible became visible, when the unspoken was shouted loud enough to demand attention. And so I swallowed the pain, folded it into a tight knot inside me, and vowed to find a way forward, one where my ownership, my voice, and my dignity would no longer be up for debate. Returning from Rome, I was ready to slip back into the comforting normalcy of my life. The jet lag, the hectic meetings, the constant buzz of that ancient city. It all felt like a distant memory the moment I stepped through my condo's front door. But what greeted me was anything but normal. That sharp, acrid tang hit me almost immediately. The smell of sawdust mingled with fresh paint and the unmistakable odor of drywall dust. It was like walking into a construction zone where once there was calm. My heart sank as I took in the scene. Chaos spread across my sanctuary. Tools strewn haphazardly on the polished hardwood floor, plastic sheets half hanging over doorways, and walls scarred with fresh cuts and exposed pipes. I followed the noise, the clatter of a hammer striking wood echoing through the narrow hallway. The kitchen was in shambles. My minimalist dream kitchen with its gleaming countertops, pristine appliances, and carefully chosen fixtures was half demolished. Cabinets had been ripped off their hinges, leaving jagged edges of raw wood and scattered screws. Drywall dust coated the floor like a thin winter snow, and the sink was completely removed, revealing tangled plumbing and dripping water that echoed ominously in the hollow space. The bathroom was an even harsher blow. The toilet had been yanked from the floor, leaving a gaping hole, and the vanity was nowhere to be found. Pipes dangled like broken bones, and water dripped steadily from a loose valve, each drop resonating like a ticking reminder of what was happening here without my consent. My throat tightened as I tried to digest the extent of the demolition unfolding within my walls. And then I saw him, Jackson, my brother, standing amid the wreckage, dirt-smudged and paint-spattered, wearing the same cocky grin he always had when he thought he'd gotten away with something. "Hey, Ainsley," he said with a casual ease that made my stomach churn. It was as if he'd caught me at the perfect moment to deliver his news, as if this destruction was a gift, a surprise party for me. "We're renovating before moving in," he explained, gesturing broadly at the mess around us. Me, Emily, and the kids. Figured it'd be easier to get everything ready ahead of time so the place feels like home when we settle in. I blinked, trying to steady my voice. "You're renovating? Without asking me? Without any notice?" My words felt brittle, the disbelief thickening my throat. Jackson shrugged, completely unfazed. "Well, yeah, it's a family thing, right? We're just making it better for everyone, especially the kids. No big deal." I glanced around, desperate for support, and my gaze landed on my parents. My mother was chuckling softly, a dismissive smile tugging at her lips, like this whole scene was a harmless joke. "Ainsley, don't be so uptight," she said, her voice light but laden with patronizing warmth. "It's just a little work. For the family." Emily, leaning casually against the doorframe, smirked and added, "You're always so sensitive. We're just helping out." The laughter bubbled up around me, a cruel soundtrack that made my blood run cold. Their amusement was suffocating, a tight grip squeezing down on my chest. My ownership of this condo, the countless sacrifices I'd made to buy and maintain it, seemed utterly invisible in their eyes. It wasn't just the property, it was my hard-won sanctuary, my personal fortress that was being dismantled without so much as a conversation. I wanted to scream, to demand respect and say, "This is my home, my investment. You can't just barge in and tear it apart." But the words stuck in my throat, lodged there by years of being dismissed and belittled. Instead, I forced out the simplest response I could manage, a quiet, "Okay." The word felt like a stone dropping into an abyss, hollow and heavy. It masked the storm raging beneath my calm exterior, the shock, the hurt, the rising fury. I felt like I was standing still as the world I knew was crumbling, piece by piece, under the hammer of entitlement. That night, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, I sat alone amid the cacophony of power tools and hammer strikes. The relentless pounding echoed through the walls like a relentless assault on everything I'd built. Drills buzzed and saws whined, each sound slicing through the silence that should have been mine. I replayed the scene in my mind over and over. The grin on Jackson's face, my parents' chuckles, Emily's mocking tone. The condo wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was my declaration of independence, a symbol of my years of hard work and sacrifice. And here it was, being torn apart like a plaything. In the quiet moments, between the noise and the dust, I realized this was no ordinary renovation. It was a blatant crossing of boundaries, a disregard for my rights and efforts. Jackson and his family were treating my home as theirs, assuming ownership without permission, and my parents were complicit in this betrayal. The weight of it settled deep inside me, a pain sharper than any physical wound. This was more than property damage. It was a fracture in the family's foundation, the unveiling of hard truths I'd long tried to ignore. And as I sat there, surrounded by chaos that wasn't mine, I knew this moment would change everything. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I could no longer stand by silently while my home and my dignity were dismantled before my eyes. That night, after everyone had left and the noise of the day's demolition finally began to fade, I found myself alone in the chaos. The condo, my refuge, was ripped apart, walls half-stripped, pipes exposed like raw nerves, the scent of sawdust thick in the air. I sank onto the edge of the sofa, exhaustion pressing down on me. But it wasn't just physical tiredness. It was the crushing weight of betrayal, the slow burn of grief twisting into something darker, something fiercer. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle around me, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a loose pipe. In that stillness, memories flooded in, decades of being the family's invisible anchor, the one who paid bills, smoothed tensions, and sacrificed quietly. I remembered lending Jackson money when his fledgling business was nothing but a shaky dream. I recalled the nights spent on hold with service providers to fix my parents' endless home problems, the birthday parties I organized, the constant juggle of schedules and crises. Every time I gave, I believed I was knitting the family closer together. But now, sitting in this torn-apart apartment, I realized I'd been stringing myself along in a one-sided bargain. The anger simmered beneath the surface, slow and steady, like a fire coaxed to life after years of being smothered. How would I let this happen? How would I become the family's emotional and financial backbone, yet was treated like a mere convenience? Jackson's grin that day, the audacity of his claim on my home, it was a slap in the face, a symbol of everything I'd endured in silence. And my parents, who should have been my allies, laughing it off as if my feelings were nothing more than a passing whim. I thought about how many times my voice had been dismissed, how many pleas for respect had been twisted into complaints about my sensitivity or stubbornness. The realization settled like cold stone in my chest. They didn't see me. Not really. They saw a resource to be tapped into, a steady supplier of favors and financial support, someone who would silently absorb their demands without question. But I was done absorbing. Done tolerating. The grief of being invisible melted into a fierce resolve. I owed them nothing. Not my money, not my silence, not my dignity. I owed myself respect. I remembered the countless times I'd been sidelined. Moments at family dinners where Jackson's achievements were toasted while mine were barely acknowledged. Times I'd been excluded from vacations or left out of important decisions. I'd rationalized it as family quirks, as if love was messy and imperfect. But now it was crystal clear. It was entitlement camouflaged as tradition, favoritism masquerading as family loyalty. The condo, once my proud fortress, had become a battleground. Jackson's assumption that he could invade my space without so much as a conversation was the ultimate expression of that entitlement. They weren't just breaking down walls, they were breaking down the boundaries I'd set, shattering the respect I deserved. As the night deepened, the quiet fury gathered strength. I thought of Ethan's steady presence, his quiet encouragement to be patient, to keep the peace. But patience had limits, and mine had been stretched to the breaking point. I no longer wanted to be the peacemaker in a war that wasn't mine to fight. I wanted to be the one who stood firm, who reclaimed what was rightfully hers. The condo was more than a space. It was the sum of my sacrifices, my independence, my hard-won achievements. To let it be taken without consequence would be to accept years of being overlooked, undervalued, and dismissed. Sitting alone, surrounded by the dust and debris, I made a silent vow. This was my line in the sand. I wouldn't let them walk over me any longer. No more erasure. No more invisible chains disguised as family ties. It was time to stand up, not just for the condo, but for myself. The fire inside me burned hotter now, a steady blaze of determination that would not be quenched by laughter or dismissal. I would make them see me. I would make them respect me. And if they refused, then I would build my life on my own terms, boundaries intact, dignity restored. In that quiet, broken space, I found a kind of clarity I'd never had before. The family I thought I knew was fractured, and so was I. But from the cracks, something new could emerge. I wasn't just a giver or a fixer. I was a woman who knew her worth, and I was ready to claim it, no matter what came next. In the days that followed that stormy return, I began to shift from shock and hurt into a quiet, steely resolve. I knew I couldn't let this slide. Not this time. The condo was more than just a building. It was a testament to years of sacrifice, hard work, and a dream I had nurtured alone. To let Jackson bulldoze through it without permission was an affront I could no longer tolerate. But I also recognized that anger alone wouldn't win this battle. I needed a plan, a strategy rooted in facts and legal standing, one that respected my professionalism as a project manager and my role as the owner. The first step was to map out exactly how much the family depended on me, not just emotionally, but financially and legally. I started by reviewing all the accounts I managed for the family. The joint savings I'd set up years ago that, over time, had morphed into a de facto emergency fund for Jackson's business crises and my parents' unexpected expenses. I froze these accounts quietly, knowing that cutting off access abruptly would be noticed and likely resented, but it was necessary. Their reliance on my financial support had been enabling the entitlement I was now confronting head-on. Next, I turned my attention to the condo itself. Legally, it was mine, purchased solely with my savings, with the deed firmly in my name. I pulled out the paperwork, scrutinizing every clause, every stipulation about ownership, use, and modification. I reminded myself that the law was unequivocal here. No renovations could proceed without the owner's consent and proper permits. This was a key lever I could pull, and I intended to use it effectively. While maintaining an outward calm, I began quietly documenting the state of the renovations. I took hundreds of photographs, close-ups of exposed drywall, plumbing ripped out without a permit, electrical wiring left dangerously hanging. I recorded timestamps on my phone to establish a clear timeline of unauthorized work. The cacophony of drills and hammers outside my door became a soundtrack to my growing dossier of evidence. Each snapshot was a silent rebellion, a visual ledger of their disregard for my property and authority. I also made it a point to gather any communication I had with Jackson, Emily, and my parents about the renovations. Text messages, emails, voicemails. I backed them all up meticulously. Their dismissive tones, half-hearted apologies, and outright refusals to discuss plans would be crucial if this escalated to legal intervention. I wasn't going to be caught off guard again, and I wasn't going to be gaslit into silence. In parallel, I reached out to a trusted attorney I'd consulted years ago about the condo purchase and property laws. I laid out the situation clearly and calmly, requesting guidance on how to assert my rights swiftly and effectively. The lawyer advised me on sending formal cease and desist notices to Jackson and the contractor involved, emphasizing the importance of halting construction immediately due to the lack of permits and owner consent. It was reassuring to know that the law was firmly on my side, a quiet but powerful ally. While I prepared this legal groundwork, I also began changing the locks on the condo. It was a symbolic step as much as a practical one, a reclaiming of control. I didn't want to provoke a confrontation, so I coordinated with the locksmith to perform the change discreetly, ensuring I retained copies of all keys. I made sure to notify the condo association of the situation, explaining that unauthorized work was underway and that I was taking steps to address it. Their involvement could add pressure on Jackson to cease the renovations. Security cameras went up next. I set them in discreet corners, covering entryways and common areas. It wasn't paranoia. It was prudence. Those cameras would provide irrefutable proof of any further unauthorized access or damage. I spent hours configuring notifications on my phone so that every motion or sound within the condo would alert me immediately, even if I wasn't present. Throughout all this, I maintained a calm exterior in front of my family. When Jackson called, I answered politely but firmly, careful not to reveal the extent of my preparations. My parents and Emily continued to downplay the issue, expecting me to relent as usual. But inside, a quiet storm was gathering. I was no longer the passive sister or the silent provider. I was a woman setting firm boundaries, armed with knowledge, documentation, and the law. At night, when the noise from the construction finally died down, I would sit at the kitchen table, half stripped and scarred, and review the evidence I'd collected. The condo, battered and violated, was a painful reminder of what was at stake, but it also became a symbol of resilience, a battleground where I would stake my claim not just as an owner, but as a person who demanded respect. I realized that this phase, this strategic planning, was crucial. It was the foundation for everything that would come next. If I faltered here, if I allowed emotions to cloud my actions, the family's entitlement and disrespect would only deepen. But if I acted decisively, with method and patience, I could turn the tide. I wasn't just fighting for a condo. I was fighting for myself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a rare sense of clarity and strength. The house of cards they'd built on my generosity and silence was beginning to wobble. What remained to be seen was how far I was willing to go, and how much they were willing to lose, before the tide turned. The quiet of the night was punctuated by the faint hum of city life beyond my windows, but inside me, a plan was taking shape. One that was patient but unyielding, calculated but fierce. The next move was mine. After the initial storm of shock and disbelief, I realized I couldn't let myself be swept away by panic or bitterness. I needed a clear head, a plan grounded in action. So I began to pull back, slowly, deliberately, on everything that had kept this family dynamic afloat for so many years. The first step was financial. For years, I had quietly been the family's safety net, often without acknowledgement. I managed joint accounts that my parents' and Jackson's business depended on. I transferred funds for repairs, paid bills on their behalf, and covered emergency expenses without asking questions. But now, I froze these accounts. No fanfare, no dramatic announcements, just a calm cessation of access. I could almost hear the silent shock when Jackson called the next day. His voice was sharp, but tinged with confusion. "Ainsley, what's going on? I tried to make a transfer and it's not going through." I kept my tone steady, carefully neutral. "I'm reviewing the finances. I'll let you know if anything changes." That was all I said. No explanations, no apologies. Let them stew in uncertainty. It was time they felt the consequences of their unchecked entitlement. Next was the social front. I started declining invitations to family events, the very ones that had long been a stage where Jackson and Emily took center stage, and I was reduced to a sideline observer. When my mother called to invite me to a weekend dinner, I hesitated before saying, "I'm going to pass this time. I need some space." Margaret, ever the peacemaker for Jackson, laughed lightly on the other end. "Oh, Ainsley, you're being dramatic. Family is important." I let the call end without argument. Family was important. To me, yes, but not at the expense of my dignity. I realized that by attending those events, I'd been enabling their disrespect. My absence was a quiet statement, a refusal to play the part of the compliant daughter who silently bore their disregard. And then there were the calls from Jackson. I started delaying my responses, sometimes letting the phone ring through. When I did answer, I kept conversations brief and factual, refusing to engage in his usual attempts to gaslight or guilt-trip me. His tone often shifted from casual to desperate over time, but I didn't waver. Meanwhile, I took a critical step. I informed the condo association about the unauthorized work. I sent a formal email detailing the renovation happening without permits. the potential safety hazards with exposed wiring and plumbing, and my concerns about property damage. I included photographs I'd taken discreetly, documenting everything from damaged walls to dangerous debris. The association responded promptly, assuring me they'd send an inspector to evaluate the situation. This wasn't just a protective move for my property, it was a strategic one. Official involvement meant pressure on Jackson and his contractor to halt the work and adhere to regulations. Around this time, I changed the locks on the condo. It wasn't a decision I took lightly, but it felt necessary. I coordinated with a locksmith to replace the door hardware discreetly, ensuring I retained all keys. The new locks were a physical barrier, a clear signal that access was no longer open to those who disregarded my rights. To bolster security further, I installed cameras in common areas and entry points. The devices were small but powerful. They streamed footage directly to my phone, alerting me instantly if anyone entered without permission. It was a modern shield around my sanctuary, a way to monitor ongoing violations without confrontation. Throughout these moves, I maintained a composed exterior. When my parents or Jackson confronted me, I responded calmly, masking the storm that was building inside. They still chuckled at what they perceived as my mood swings, dismissing the shift as temporary irritation. But beneath the surface, I was steeling myself. Every step, freezing funds, declining invitations, notifying authorities, changing locks, installing cameras, was a deliberate reclaiming of control. I was no longer the silent victim of their entitlement. I was setting boundaries, constructing walls not just of wood and locks, but of resolve and self-respect. The family's oblivious arrogance only sharpened the tension. Jackson assumed my silence meant surrender. My parents thought my distance was a passing phase, but I knew better. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would no longer allow my kindness to be mistaken for weakness. As the days passed, the condo's half-finished chaos became a backdrop to my quiet but firm assertion of authority. The drills and hammers still echoed, but now they underscored a conflict that had moved beyond family pleasantries into the realm of rights and respect. I sensed their confusion and frustration growing, but I held firm. My patience was a weapon, my calm a shield. The next moves were mine to make, and I was ready to play a long game. The moment I sent that first formal notice, I felt a shift in the air, a quiet but unmistakable tremor beneath the surface of our family dynamics. The letter was concise, professional, and unequivocal. I revoked Jackson's access rights to the condo immediately, demanding an immediate halt to all renovation work. The tone was firm, the language legal but clear. No further demolition, no construction, no entry without my explicit permission. I wasn't just asserting ownership, I was drawing a hard boundary around the space that was mine. I remember sitting at the battered kitchen table, the one still dusty, scattered with tools and peeling paint chips, typing out that email. The cursor blinked as I carefully chose every word, mindful that this was no longer a personal plea, but a formal declaration of authority. I attached the photos I'd taken, the exposed wiring swinging like a live wire, the plumbing ripped out crudely, the mounds of debris threatening to damage the floors I'd painstakingly restored. It was evidence, a silent witness to their reckless intrusion. After sending the notice, I escalated the situation by reporting the violations to the city's building department. Unauthorized renovations without permits are not only illegal, they're dangerous. I included the same photographic evidence, descriptions of the work in progress, and a timeline showing the renovations began without my consent. Within hours, I received confirmation that the city inspectors would be visiting to assess the site. I felt a surge of vindication. The law was a sword in my hand now, cutting through the entitlement and disrespect that had long plagued my family. This wasn't about petty disputes anymore. It was about enforcing rules that protected my property and safety. The family's reaction came swift, but predictable. Jackson called almost immediately after the notices went out, his voice a mix of confusion and thinly veiled anger. "Ainsley, why are you doing this? It's family. We're just trying to help. You can't shut us out like this." I kept my voice calm, almost clinical. "Jackson, I own this property. You had no permission to start renovations. This is about legal compliance and respect. The work must stop immediately. He hesitated, then tried a different tactic. Guilt. Mom and Dad think you're overreacting. They say you're being difficult. Isn't this just about us making a home? I sighed, resisting the urge to raise my voice. My parents' opinions don't override my rights. I'm not being difficult. I'm enforcing boundaries. This is my home and I expect it to be respected. That conversation ended with Jackson's frustrated silence, but my phone was already buzzing with more messages. Emily texting thinly veiled threats about family damage and trust breaking. My parents, predictably, urged me to keep the peace, as if compliance was the solution, but I wasn't about to back down. Over the next few days, city inspectors arrived. I greeted them at the door, explaining the situation calmly and handing over the documentation I'd compiled. Their initial inspection confirmed several violations. Work had proceeded without permits. There were serious safety hazards with exposed electrical wiring, and the plumbing had been altered without professional oversight. They issued official stop work orders, and fines began to accumulate against the property's activity. Hearing about those fines gave me a bittersweet satisfaction. Jackson's careless assumption that he could treat my condo as a playground was unraveling. The consequences were real and immediate, and for once, it was not me bearing their weight. At the same time, I formally notified the condo association, pressing them to enforce community rules about unauthorized renovations and noise disturbances. They responded with seriousness, sending letters to Jackson and escalating to board meetings where the family's reputation was quietly scrutinized. The condo, once a symbol of my independence, had become a battleground not just within my family, but within the community I valued. Parallel to these legal maneuvers, I took practical steps to assert control. I officially changed the locks on the condo doors, ensuring Jackson and his family could no longer enter at will. Evicting them from the property was a desperate move, but necessary. I explained the situation to the locksmith as a security measure, and the new keys were mine alone. I also disconnected shared utilities, electricity, water, internet, that had been running under my name but used by Jackson's family during renovations. It was a calculated step, not intended to punish, but to underline the reality that their presence here was unauthorized and temporary until things were settled properly. The family, of course, didn't take this quietly. Calls flooded my phone. Pleas, angry accusations, even sobbing threats of family rifts. "We're family," Jackson would say again and again. Family comes first. But now, I saw the phrase for what it was. A hollow excuse to trample over boundaries and entitlement disguised as love. Meanwhile, I found an unexpected steadiness in this storm. Every legal document sent, every door locked, every phone call politely ended or redirected, reinforced my growing sense of control. The condo wasn't just a building anymore. It was my statement, and I was ready to defend it, piece by piece. The tension simmered beneath each interaction. Jackson's usual charm cracked, replaced by frustration that no amount of pleading or manipulation could alleviate. Emily's calls grew sharper, but I remained calm, refusing to engage in their attempts to gaslight or guilt me into compliance. In those moments, I felt something I hadn't in years: clarity. My family's assumption that I would quietly absorb their demands was shattered. I wasn't just the sister or the daughter anymore. I was the rightful owner, the one who held the power to say yes or no. As the city's stop work orders came down and legal pressure mounted, I could almost see the fragile web of entitlement unraveling around Jackson. The condo, my sanctuary, was becoming the fulcrum for change, a place where respect was demanded, not begged for. But even as I stood firm, I knew this was just the beginning of a longer battle. The tools of law and locks were powerful, but the emotional war, breaking years of taken-for-granted generosity and unraveling family dynamics, was far from over. I sat back one evening, watching the fading light cast long shadows across the half-finished kitchen, and felt a steely resolve settle deep within me. The condo was mine, and I wasn't giving it up without a fight. The hard part wasn't just stopping the renovations, it was reclaiming my voice, my boundaries, and the respect I deserved. And so, With the city inspector's orders in hand and locked doors between me and my brother's family, the next chapter of this story was unfolding. The question now was how far each of us was willing to go in this family reckoning, and whether respect could ever be restored on my terms. The fallout from my firm stance began almost immediately, and it hit harder than I'd anticipated. Almost overnight, the consequences of Jackson's unauthorized renovation started piling up like an avalanche, burying not just his plans, but his entire family's sense of security within my condo. First came the mounting fines. The city's building department didn't mess around. After the inspection confirmed multiple violations, no permits, unsafe electrical wiring, exposed plumbing, they slapped hefty penalties on the property. Each notification arrived with a crisp official tone, a reminder that the law was now very much involved. Jackson's face when I showed him those letters was a cocktail of disbelief and anger. He hadn't expected the weight of authority to fall so heavily on him. The realization that this wasn't just a family squabble but a legal infraction unsettled him, yet it didn't make him relent. Then, there were eviction threats from the Condo Association. Their patience was wearing thin. Residents had started complaining about the noise, debris left in hallways, and strangers wandering the building while Jackson's crew worked. The association sent formal warnings demanding that all unauthorized work cease immediately, and that my brother's family vacate the premises. I could see the panic flicker in Jackson's eyes when he received the notices. The very home he'd presumed to take over was slipping away under the weight of regulations and neighborhood pressure. Neighbors, too, began voicing their concerns. Some stopped me in the hallways, whispering about the chaos in my condo. Others reported the disturbances directly to the building management. The whispers quickly turned into headlines, and the quiet sympathy many once held for Jackson's ambitious family project shifted to doubt and frustration. Word traveled fast in our tight-knit community, and not in Jackson's favor. As these pressures mounted, Jackson's demeanor shifted from cocky entitlement to desperate pleading. His calls and texts came in waves, sometimes frantic, sometimes begging, always laced with manipulation. "Ainsley, please, we're family," he'd say, his voice cracking with frustration. "Can't you just give us a little more time? We'll fix everything. I promise it'll be worth it." But beneath the surface was a thinly veiled threat, a subtle reminder of all the ways he'd leaned on me before. Emily joined in the chorus, her messages dripping with condescension and guilt-tripping. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said once in a text. "We're trying to make a home for our kids. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" But what they wanted was clear. My compliance, my silent surrender. Their words felt like a trap, loaded with the expectation that family bonds should override rights and respect. Margaret and Robert, predictably, tried to mediate, but in ways that only deepened the divide. My mother's voice on the phone was a blend of disappointment and thinly veiled criticism. "Ainsley, you're pushing them away. Family comes first. Maybe if you softened your stance, things wouldn't be so difficult." My father was quieter, occasionally echoing her sentiments, but never challenging me directly. Their attempts felt like pressure to maintain the status quo, to forgive the transgressions for the sake of family harmony. But harmony without respect wasn't harmony at all. Through it all, I held my ground. I didn't escalate the tone or engage in their blame games. Instead, I listened patiently, acknowledged their emotions, and repeated my position calmly. This is about respect, legality, and boundaries. The work must stop. The fines must be paid. Unauthorized occupation isn't acceptable. It was exhausting to be firm in the face of emotional onslaught, but I knew giving in would unravel everything I was fighting for. Strangely, the anger and desperation from Jackson's camp only steeled my resolve. Each pleading call, each guilt-laden message reminded me of how much they had taken for granted over the years. Their facade of family-first love had always been a one-way street, with me as the perpetual giver and them as the perpetual takers. Meanwhile, the community's reaction fueled my sense of justice. I wasn't alone in recognizing the unfairness here. The condo, my sanctuary, had become a symbol not of family unity, but of entitlement exposed. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the neighborhood was watching, that Jackson's reputation was quietly eroding beneath the surface of his bravado. This shift hit home the truth that had been simmering beneath my calm exteriors for years. The golden child status Jackson enjoyed wasn't invincible. It was conditional, fragile, and dependent on my continued compliance. Remove that compliance, and the whole illusion crumbled. In the midst of this turmoil, my phone's relentless buzzing became a soundtrack to the unfolding drama. Urgent voices, desperate pleas, veiled threats of family fractures. "We're family," Jackson repeated like a mantra, trying to weaponize the bond that had so often been used to silence me. But this time, that bond was my shield, not my chain. I didn't respond to every call or message. Some went unanswered, others met with short, matter-of-fact replies. The balance of power was shifting, and I was no longer the one bending under pressure. I was the one holding the line. While the family's panic grew louder, I found an unexpected steadiness. The chaos inside the condo, the half-finished walls, the drywall dust, the empty shell of my bathroom and kitchen, became a battleground where I was asserting not just ownership of a property, but ownership of my own dignity. The question lurking beneath every conversation and every fine was clear. How far would Jackson go to reclaim what he assumed was his by right? And how far was I willing to go to protect what was mine? The tension was thick, the stakes real, and the family's pleas ringing hollow against the reality of consequences. The coming days promised even more challenges, but for now, as I stood firm amidst the mounting pressure, I felt a fierce clarity. This was my fight, and I wasn't backing down. The fallout from my firm stance hit harder than I had anticipated, a tidal wave of repercussions crashing down on Jackson and his family. Almost overnight, the mounting fines from the city's building department began to stack up like an unyielding wall. The violations were serious: unauthorized renovations without permits, unsafe electrical wiring left exposed, and plumbing work done by unlicensed hands. Each notice that landed in my mailbox was a cold reminder that their reckless assumption of entitlement was now met with tangible consequences. I could almost see the disbelief and anger flickering across Jackson's face every time I showed him one of those letters. He had counted on my silence, on my usual willingness to smooth things over, but the weight of official authority bearing down on him unsettled even his bravado. Yet, despite the fines and formal warnings, he didn't relent. The condo association's patience wore thin quickly. Complaints from neighbors about the constant noise, construction debris cluttering hallways, and unfamiliar workers wandering the building became frequent. The association sent stern letters demanding that all unauthorized work cease immediately, and that Jackson's family vacate the premises. The thought of eviction notices hanging over their heads seemed to shake Jackson in a way I hadn't seen before. The home he had been so assuredly claiming as our family's was slipping through his fingers, unraveling under the pressure of rules and neighborhood watchfulness. Whispers from neighbors, once polite inquiries, turned into pointed remarks behind closed doors. The community's quiet support began to shift toward me, the wrong donor, as they watched Jackson's family's disregard unfold. "It's such a shame," one neighbor confided in the elevator, "to see such disrespect for the building and rules." Another nodded. "We've been waiting for this to be addressed for weeks." Their voices, low and cautious, carried a surprising weight, and I felt a subtle but powerful vindication in knowing that this wasn't just my private battle anymore. The social fabric around Jackson was fraying, and his reputation was quietly being chipped away. As the pressure mounted, Jackson's tone changed from cocky entitlement to near desperation. His calls flooded my phone, swinging wildly between pleading and anger. "Ainsley, please," he begged one afternoon, voice cracking with frustration. "We're family. Can't you just give us a little more time? We'll fix everything. I swear it'll be worth it." Those words, so familiar yet so manipulative, barely touched me anymore. Beneath his desperation, I detected a threat, a subtle warning meant to remind me of all the favors he'd leaned on in the past. Emily, too, became a relentless presence in my messages. Her texts were a mixture of condescension and guilt-tripping. "You're making this harder than it has to be," she scolded. "We're trying to build a home for our kids. Doesn't any of that mean anything to you? The implied demand for compliance was unmistakable. Their combined efforts felt like a trap, designed to wear down my resolve and coerce me back into playing the role of the compliant sister. But I was no longer that person. My parents, predictably, tried to intervene with their version of mediation. My mother's voice on the phone was tinged with disappointment, but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of blame. "Ainsley, you're pushing them away. Family comes first. Maybe if you softened your stance, things wouldn't be so difficult." Her words echoed a toxic refrain I'd heard for years, the idea that my boundaries were the problem. My father, quieter but just as firm in his bias, occasionally echoed her sentiments but never challenged me directly. Their mediations felt less like attempts to find peace and more like efforts to preserve Jackson's favored status. It was exhausting. Through all these emotional assaults, I held firm. I didn't rise to their bait or get dragged into their blame games. When Jackson called, when Emily sent her guilt-laden messages, and when my mother urged reconciliation, I responded with calm, measured replies. This is about respect, legality, and boundaries. The work must stop immediately. The fines must be addressed. Unauthorized occupation cannot continue. It drained me to maintain composure amid such a storm, but I knew that any wavering would only undo everything I had fought to regain. Ironically, the barrage of desperation and anger from Jackson's camp only fueled my determination. Every guilt trip, every veiled threat, every tearful plea reminded me of how much they had taken for granted for so long. The phrase "family first" had always been one-sided, something they wielded to silence me, to demand my sacrifices. Now it was my shield. Their pleas bounced off a wall I was no longer willing to let them knock down. Meanwhile, the community's quiet support bolstered my sense of justice. I wasn't just standing against my brother's entitlement. I was defending fairness in the eyes of neighbors who had grown weary of the disruption. The condo, once a private sanctuary, had become a symbol of exposed entitlement and rightful boundaries. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing that Jackson's carefully crafted image was cracking, that his reputation was eroding beneath the surface of his bravado. This shift laid bare a harsh truth. Jackson's golden child status was conditional, fragile, and entirely dependent on my past compliance. Remove my willingness to absorb their demands, and the whole illusion of privilege crumbled. It was like watching a delicate house of cards collapse under the weight of ignored responsibilities. The relentless buzz of my phone became the soundtrack of this family reckoning. Urgent voices, desperate pleas, and sometimes thinly veiled threats of fractured relationships. "We're family," Jackson repeated endlessly, trying to weaponize the blood ties that had so often been used against me. But now, that bond was a shield protecting me, not a chain binding me. I didn't answer every call. Some messages I left unread. Others were met with short, factual replies. The balance of power was shifting, and I was no longer the one bending to their whims. I was the one standing firm. As the city's stop work orders stood firm, and the condo association's eviction notices loomed, the chaotic mess of the half-finished kitchen and bathroom became the backdrop of a family war where I claimed not just ownership of property, but ownership of my dignity and boundaries. Every interaction, every fine, every complaint raised the question, just how far was Jackson willing to go to reclaim what he assumed was his birthright, and how far was I prepared to go to protect what was mine? The tension thickened, the stakes grew higher, and as their pleas rang hollow against the concrete reality of consequences, I stood firm, resolute and unyielding. This was my fight, and I wasn't backing down. The condo had finally been restored to my terms, walls patched, plumbing repaired, cabinets replaced, and the chaos of unauthorized renovations swept away like a bad dream. Walking through each room, I felt the air inside shift. It was more than the absence of dust and debris. It was a reclamation of my space, my rules, my dignity. This wasn't just about a place to live. It was a declaration that my boundaries mattered, and I was done being invisible. I knew that the fight hadn't ended with the last nail hammered or the final coat of paint dried. This was the beginning of a new phase, one where the family needed to understand what respect truly meant. So, when the dust settled, I reached out quietly, Not with open arms, but with clear conditions. I told them, I'm willing to have family contact, but it must be built on respect, honesty, and accountability. Without those, I can't invite toxicity into my life or my home. Saying it aloud, even in a letter and a few measured phone calls, was difficult. Those words carried the weight of years of hurt and disappointment, but also the promise of change. I wasn't asking for blind forgiveness or unconditional acceptance. I was setting a new foundation, one that I'd been denied for far too long. The response was mixed and predictable. Jackson scoffed at the idea of accountability, seeing it as a challenge to his entitlement. Emily dismissed it as dramatic, and my parents hesitated, caught between hope for family unity and their deep-seated loyalties. But I stood firm, knowing that the true measure of family wasn't blood alone. It was the respect and care we show one another. In the quiet moments away from their voices, I leaned heavily on Ethan and my close circle of friends. Their unwavering support reminded me that family isn't just defined by genetics. It's also the people who see your worth and stand beside you. With them, I found peace and strength I hadn't realized I'd lost. The condo itself, once a symbol of conflict, became a sanctuary again. I invested time and care into restoring the flow I once cherished, the gentle hum of the city beneath my windows, the soft glow of evening light across the hardwood floors, the scent of my favorite candles filling the air. It was a daily reminder that this space belonged to me, and that my peace was non-negotiable. Yet, I also knew the path ahead wasn't simple. The McDonald family faced a choice: to grow, to acknowledge past wounds and rebuild with honesty, or to remain fractured by entitlement and denial. I couldn't control their decisions, but I could control mine. And mine was clear. I would protect my boundaries and prioritize my dignity above all else. I realized that embracing autonomy didn't mean closing the door forever. It meant opening it on my terms, with eyes wide open and a heart guarded, but hopeful. Respect, honesty, and accountability weren't just demands. They were the pillars I needed to feel safe and valued again. As I stood by the window one evening, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I felt a quiet resolve settle deep inside me. The battle had been long and painful, but it had forged a new version of myself, stronger, clearer, and unapologetically grounded in self-respect. Whatever happened next with my family, I knew I was no longer defined by their expectations or their disregard. I was the owner of my home, my choices, and my future, and that truth was a light I would carry with me, no matter where the road led.